Hello and welcome to another edition of Closed Mode, the Enterprise Sales Podcast. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, and today we're all lucky to be here with Dylan Ferguson, who is the Senior Director of Sales of Fullcast. Dylan is a 10 times President Club award achiever, so a rock star in doing enterprise sales, and Fullcast really exists to reduce revenue pain for companies. So Dylan, thanks so much for being here today and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and excited to get to be part of your podcast.
Well, when you and I were chatting the other day, we were speaking about territory management, and you had some interesting ideas for ways to improve it. And it's funny when we're doing these pre-interviews, I'm always looking for someone who has chops in something, and it's like you were talking about territory management in a way that I wasn't familiar with. So I was like, cool, we can all learn from this. So you made a correlation between hitting quota and better territory management. In fact, I believe you said 52% of reps are hitting quota. Let's start with sort of the downside. What mistakes are people making in territory management that are hurting goal attainment?
Yeah, I think it's that they're not zoomed out enough, frankly. I mean, to give a bigger take on it, it's that we're treating this like such a micro adjustment, micro approach, this account to this person kind of an approach. But the way we're planning and the way we're starting as an organization, thinking about our revenue process is super painful. Most companies are working with disparate tools, right? A module from an HRS system, a module from a CRM, a module from the finance department. They've got FP&A involved. They've got sales involved. They've got marketing involved. They've got RevOps involved. They got sales operations involved. But there's really no centralized place for them to collaborate. So it's all ending up in spreadsheets, here a little and there a little. And when they finally get through what companies will call the carve, where they actually carve out the territory plans and then push them out to the reps, then comes a cavalcade of tickets where there's 750 tickets on exception handling, accounts that need to be moved or that were assigned improperly. This rep's upset and is going to leave if they don't get this one back. And then they spend another 3 months solving those problems. And before you know it, you've got 6 months left into your fiscal year. You've seen plan drift. Hiring hasn't happened the way you thought it was going to happen. Quota you've assigned to those TBHs didn't really develop. And before you know it, I mean, it's all art and no science. Right. And so the biggest mistake is just allowing that to continue because you don't know there's a better way to go about it. And also our planning tends to be annual based, right? We do it once because it's too painful to do twice. And then it's just knob turning throughout the year to survive. And so that's one of the reasons why, I wrote a check and invested in a company called Fullcast. It's the same executive leadership team that I worked with in the services world when I was in the Salesforce space. We started a company called Simplus, and we took it from $0 to 600 million in 7 years. And so that same team said, okay, we've nailed services. We want to go get into like an integrated software and services take on the world. What's a problem we want to solve? We recognized no one had really solved the revenue challenge at the large enterprise because there's so much complexity there.
Yeah.
And most of the tools that have been built were designed to be, for lack of a better word, an easy button. But what they found out in the marketplace is nobody wants an easy button because no one has anything easy. So they're looking for a way to have the freedom of their complexity. And so what tool can be flexible enough to allow us to be who we are instead of forced into some box to do something the way we don't really do it as a business, but at the same time give us the automation, to use a buzzword, AI technologies that can co-pilot and help me through my decision-making process, but also the collaboration capability where I can see what's been recommended by sales, what's been recommended by marketing, what's been recommended by sales ops and rev ops, and then decide as a team which ones we're going to push and which ones we aren't. And then there's actually like a rules engine that will push that to your CRM and on an automatic format. Whereas most of that time, once all those decisions are made, you have to go to your CRM team and say, now go figure out how to take all this complexity we created on a 1,500 pivot table spreadsheet and push that into our CRM and don't make any mistakes.
It's interesting too that going back to your comment about sort of the annualized nature of this, I remember seeing a lot of research over the years as it relates to enterprise selling and saying if you can bring more stuff to being process oriented from random, we're in great shape. But now dynamics really emerging. The notion of dynamic, because everything's changing so quickly that it used to be enough to say, let's bring some process to this stuff. And now it's becoming, which is a challenge at an even higher level, is dynamic and reacting. So we talked a little bit of, you described this hornet's nest, I think, earlier when I asked you about mistakes people make. What are the few top, the top two or three ideas that we should be thinking about for more effective territory management?
Well, number one, you got to think about your talent pool. It's the most expensive thing you have is your data and your people, especially salespeople. Um, so if you get a salesperson wrong, that could cost you $1 million that year, in lost revenue and in what you're paying to fully burden that employee. And so, we all have this concept of talent when it comes to things like major league sports. Your salespeople are your athletes, and you should think about them the way these sports teams think about their athletes. Except the difference is that we don't get worse as we get older. We tend to get better because of the experience and the cycles we've seen and the relationships we've built. And so when you go back to that comment about only 52% are hitting their number, I really don't think it's because salespeople aren't good or they're not good sellers. I think a lot of it, when it goes back to your mistake question, is that we're not setting them up to win.
Yeah.
We're taking the people that are successful and continuing to feed them so they stay successful, and then we're taking the rest of them and giving them everything else, hoping that they're going to make a territory great. But we're not making investments to make those territories great. So look at the
Yes.
Major League Baseball. You've got cities that are perennially successful and hitting the mark, and then you've got some that aren't. And there's a large reason why, whether it's a talent pool, whether it's budget, and so understanding your talent pool and recognizing that you're not just investing in a salesperson for year one and making your money on them when you think about their quota is. If you can set a salesperson up to, on paper, be successful, meaning they hit their quota, they made their money, they're going to stick around.
Yes.
And so if you raise everything too high on them based off of science that doesn't exist in that territory, I'll give you an example. Most companies I've worked with, the Pacific Northwest has been a troublesome area. And that was back before COVID and when we were more geography assigned from a quota standpoint. For whatever reason, that territory was always an underperformer for most companies that I worked at. But they were carrying similar quotas to the people that were in LA
Yeah.
and San Francisco and New York. COVID did some interesting things in that we got this idea of distributed workforce, which means we could put the best people anywhere we wanted them, which is great. But at the same time, it's had to help us rethink the way we align territory. So territory used to be largely quota and territory would align based off of your geography. Now it can be aligned based off of industry. It could be aligned based off of product. It could be aligned based off of accounts. Like I know people that have accounts for just one account. That's their whole life, that one spot. But there's 80 divisions in that account. So it's like having 80 accounts. So having your strategic plays and knowing exactly what you want to accomplish and what you think that individual that you're creating a quota and a plan for can accomplish is a much brighter thought than making everyone the same thing, because no
Yeah.
one is the same thing.
Yeah.
So having a tool that allows you to have that kind of flexibility where you can be giving one person a quota based off of a certain set of criteria that we know is going to set them up for success and get the business where they want to be in that area, and do the same thing for somebody else in a different geography with a whole separate different variables. But you need data to understand what the historical data is telling you. For example, is the sales cycle the same timeline in the Midwest for manufacturing as it is CMT in San Francisco? Probably not. So understanding those buying cycles, understanding those industry nuances is critical to making sure that you're setting your team up for success. And if they're being successful and they're hitting metrics they know are actually achievable, they're going to stick around for a long time. And then the business benefits not just in year one, but over the next 5 to 7 years, where they have a time to actually build a franchise, so to speak, in their region.
Yeah, it's you started wandering into my next question, which is, we're thinking about building our plan for territory management. You talked about one set of data, but what's the most critical data and data sources for thinking about your territory plan?
Great question. I mean, obviously, historical data can be really important if you know what you're looking for. Now, what I've come to find is that most companies don't have systems problems, they have data problems. It's always a data problem first, and then the system can be a helpful solution if you know how to organize the data first. So I would start with your CRM, especially on the sales front, because that's where all your client data is going to be living. Obviously, being able to connect that to the money, and very often the money can be in ERP. So having those connection points, but maybe there's even just some pivot tables that you have from a spreadsheet standpoint. A lot of companies that we work with are pulling in some of these unique documents, as I would call them, within their business because there's really no other place for them to live, and then being able to have that CSV import as needed. The real challenge, though, is just understanding that the more you can get the organization of that data, the better you're going to be able to measure what that data is telling you and then perform based off of what you're learning from the data. So, for example, if you can look at historical quota achievement in a territory over the last year, you should also look at when that quota was recognized. Like, was it one rep that was at zero for an entire year, and the last day of the year they drop a $20 million deal and they look like rock stars, but like it took them that entire year. The hard thing about that rep, and they're super valuable, those reps, is that when you finally get that deal after a year, it's like paying back taxes. No one's happy that it's done except the rep.
Yeah,
And then literally the next day, they're at zero again. There's like no chance to celebrate. There's no chance to really enjoy what's been accomplished. And they're into making, writing to cashing the check they just wrote. They got the deal done, but now they got to go roll everything out. And that's their life for the next, 12
right.
to 18 months.
Yeah,
So recognizing that you got those guys and then you got grinders. Like I'm probably more in that category. Like over the last 7 years, I averaged 50 deals a year for 7 years and, did 64 million in that time frame. And so that's a different model. Whereas like, you're doing 6, 7 deals a month, you're bringing a lot of things to bear. And then there's the other guy that's bringing in with the one deal a year, but it's 20 million. So very often we compare those two. We give awards out that are very similar to one approach, which is just results driven without actually recognizing what those individual processes look like and feel like. So better understanding the way your business is getting closed, how the different reps in your business are closing those deals, when they come, how they come, what you can expect from, and then how you treat the rep during the year. Like if you're just heaping a ton of pressure on them, like, hey, one more month without you getting this when's this $20 million deal going to close? When is it going to close? When is it going to close? That doesn't really create a culture where they're thrilled about where they work. So the only reason they're sticking around in a role like that is because they know in their heart they're going to get a $20 million deal and that's a nice check.
yeah,
But so that's the challenge is like, if you can create an environment where you're listening to these people who are living these things day in and day out, and the data is actually telling you the story of what's changed, what the nuances are. Like if you're in a seasonal business, which ours kind of is right now because people call it annual planning.
yeah,
You got to know, okay, well, if they need a tool at planning time, you got to work backwards and figure out, okay, well, it's a 3-month sales cycle, and then it's 3 months to implement, and then they'll need to have it ready to go for planning time. You got to understand those cycles and then figure out how your marketing machine's getting you through those cycles and where the lumps are going to be. Because if you're a business that closes a ton of deals all at once, like an end of year situation, like you think, look at a Salesforce. I think they close something like 40% of their revenue in 1 month at the end of the year. Now you got this giant burden of rolling that out. So you need all this staff all of a sudden that can go and implement and deliver on that, those purchases. And then what are they going to do after that, right? So you've got these peaks and valleys that you're dealing with as a business, and that becomes really important when you're looking at how you're planning out spend by a quarterly basis, especially if you're a public company.
yeah,
And right now, there's just that data is just it's a treasure hunt trying to figure out where that all exists. So understanding where that data lives within your own business, and then being able to plug that into your planning model and your historical data, and then taking that information and then using that to say, should enterprise sales all have the same basic comp plan. If not, then adjust it. If you've got a comp plan based off of an outcome for a guy that's in one account, that might look very different than a guy that's, working Fortune 3000, Fortune 2000, that are doing 50 deals a year. So that's that freedom of complexity I'm talking about, by being able to craft individual plans for specific sellers that's going to set them all up for success, instead of putting them all in the same box and wondering why only 52% achieved it.
I know it's so funny. It's been frustrating for me over the years when people talk about scaling best practice to common practice. And so Susie's, a rock star hitting her number. Well, Susie's sitting in a territory that's exploding with growth, and it's like you can't unless you can find a bunch more of those territories. And I'm really glad. Like a lot of your comments were going back to that in my head, that we need a little more data than simply that. So as I was prepping for this. I would never profess myself to be a territory management expert, which is you not only know it, like you really care about it. I found that out the other day. So as I was doing my research, I was looking at the difference between territory management and territory planning, and that distinction is the first time I heard that. Is that an important distinction? Should we even care about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a gigantic difference. It's one is something you do in a moment, and the rest is what you do the rest of the year.
Okay.
So, Mike Tyson said everyone's got a plan to get punched in the mouth. Well, your plan is what you think is going to happen. John Lennon said, "Life's what happens to you while you're making plans."
Right.
So it's kind of funny. Like we as a company use this tool called a V2 Mom. It was coined by Mark Benioff at Salesforce, but it really gives you kind of a vision of how you're going to achieve and what you're going to do to accomplish your goals. And so the quarterly focus of a business is super important to achieving the annual focus. And very often we're looking too far out and we're not keeping track of the individual daily tasks that lead us to that. So to your point, you go and you create a plan, and then there's what we would call runtime territory management, right? Which is that's everything that happens after the plan's in place. So that'd be things like the daily business of sales, like this rep is going to be taking a sabbatical for paternity leave because they're having a baby. So I got to temporarily assign accounts and maybe even quota to someone else that's going to step in and support not only their current territory, but these temp accounts. And then when that person comes back, then I've got to make sure things are being transitioned back to that rep, but we don't want to ruin deal continuity. So if there's any deal cycles that are still in play, we're going to give that person another 90 days to finish those deals. And if they can't get it done in that time frame, then it will automatically port it back. Well, Fullcast creates policy engines that ties to your CRM. So for example, you can go in and set that information and it will automatically do all that for you. You're not going to have to call your CRM team and say, I need you to now move everything back. Well, what was it? And what are the accounts? And you missed one, and the rep didn't tell anybody. So that stuff happens. And then you got things like, seller attrition. People come, people go. And then there's the process of, hiring and bringing new people in and ramping up. Or maybe you've got a quota hire scenario where we're going to add 6 reps over the next 6 months. And so, keeping track of that and bringing those sellers in and setting them up in the systems and giving them a plan and then having that ramp plan measured out for them and delivered. And then you got things like M&A activities, which are really prevalent right now. Everyone's sitting on a ton of cash, and interest rates have held down a lot of the M&A activity because there's just not enough value for shareholders for the cost of money. But that's starting to lighten up. We're seeing a lot of things like Splunk and Cisco just connected yesterday, that the first day of that transition happened. So we're starting to see a little bit of this consolidation a little bit. And so that's meaning, okay, how are we now going to merge as a company? How are we going to think about compensation plans? What sort of cross-sell, upsell capabilities are there as these mergers come together? And how are we going to incentivize and compensate that? And how are we going to track it in a plan? And how are we going to think about territories, overlays, et cetera? Then you've got strategy changes, right? Like, hey, this that we're doing, not working. So we're replatforming, or
Right.
we're redoing our price book. That stuff all happens throughout the year. Again, there's no central platform to do it on. So they're in and out of 4 or 5 different platforms to try to get it all done, which makes it very manual, very prone to problem, very difficult to measure and track.
Yeah. So another question relating to territory management. If you're in software or services, does what you're selling change the way you do territory management?
Yeah, absolutely. It even changes the motion of your sale. And so understanding the different sales motions. I'll give you an example. Our company does both the software sales and the implementation services, right? So that's basically two businesses that you're running within a business. So you've got human capital and staff that you have to now think about that are going to be ready to staff and deliver on a project. You got to know what the timing of that looks like. So there's a nice handshake between the sales effort and the implementation effort. Then there's CS that comes in, right, in your customer support team that's making sure that those handoffs are smooth. And also, very often, CS is responsible for things like cross sell, upsell, renewals at times. And so understanding how their plans are going to be set up and how they're going to be compensated. So understanding those territory dynamics and then how you go soup to nuts through the entire process of a customer journey is going to be really important in terms of how you're thinking about incentivizing the right behavior with money and commission, incentivizing the right success criteria for quota achievement, attainment, and incentivizing the right criteria for your leadership that's running these teams. Like, are you compensating them by dollars or by percent of growth in region? A lot of the large enterprise companies like a Salesforce or a Workday, they're very often looking at individual regions by percent growth in the region as opposed to dollars sold. And so that's the other kind of measurement that you're trying to look at. And that's becoming more and more nuanced as we move into these complex sales and companies that can do many, many things. As you look at like a Microsoft or a Google, where they have literally hundreds of businesses within their portfolio, and they're all selling to the same companies, but there's 100 points of entry, and there's not a lot of cross collaboration that's really helping them get the most out of it. And it's largely because data hasn't largely been available to help share within the organizations what's happening and where it's happening, and that's where some of these AI tools are really valuable, like a propensity to buy. And because they bought this, they're likely to buy that. But the only way you know is if you're plugging the right data in. And on the AI side, I just have to say it because 7 years in consulting, right now, all the AI tools are largely toy apps, right? There's nothing super wide and super deep. And so we're just at that forefront. Everyone's got a crust of AI on something. But if we look 5 years down the road, that crust is going to become a full meal.
Yeah.
And these kinds of the challenges, these are the ones that we're going to be solving. And so as the data gets deeper and wider, as the insights into that data gets deeper and wider, because right now everyone's solving the data problem. But once the language model can really kick in because the data is there for it to crunch, that's when we're going to really think about the way we buy and the way we sell in a much, much different way. And territories and the way that those things are thought of and the way that products are presented, that's all going to be revolutionized. And so having a tool that allows you to create that plan, to take the best advantage of the most expensive portion of your spend as a company, which is sales and marketing, usually around 40%. You want to really make sure that you're giving yourself the best chance for success, and like trying to live in a spreadsheet is not that.
No, and it's interesting too what you say about AI is my CTO once said that there's a lot of alleged AI solutions that are Chat GPT wrappers, right? And it's just sort of
Yeah.
a thin
The whole
layer of
pilot.
yeah, for sure. So I want to go back to this idea of I'd mentioned scaling best practice to common practice, but you and I spoke about that a couple days ago, and how that's always been separate of who's sitting in the killer territory. Like, how does territory management help scale best practice to common practice? Because I think that's the holy grail for a lot of revenue leaders and sales leaders.
Yeah. Well, let me just kind of explain it this way. I think there's what we've seen get done for most of our careers. It's that we've seen it. This is how people do it. So this is how I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
When there's a breakout, when someone's doing extraordinary and you dig into it, usually they're doing something that's different than what everybody else is doing.
Yes.
And so right now you've got existing practices in go-to-market, existing practices in revenue management, existing practices in territory management or capacity planning, but they're not the best practice. They're just the ones that we're used to. So what that means is like all of us that like live and breathe every day, where our value is that I know Excel better than anyone else in the world. Um, it's scary for those guys because there's a new tool that says we don't need that skill like we used to need it because now there's a platform, right? And so instead of spending most of your time creating tables and pivots, The people that have been doing that, they have the mechanical skills, but they also have the critical thinking skills and the understanding of how to take what data is and figure out what we're going to do about what the data is telling us. The difference with a platform like this is that you're just going to spend less time under the car and more time driving it.
Right. Yeah, it's funny too. Something came to mind when I many years ago I got my MBA on weekends. I went to an executive program, and I'm thinking of like statistical analysis and that sort of stuff. And we didn't learn any of the inputs. What our professor said was, "You people, all of us were at least VPs in the room," and he's like, "You just need to know how to analyze outputs, right? That's the new skill for you. You know, you're not doing any data entry." So something else you mentioned earlier was reducing complexity for sales leaders and salespeople. I'm a huge fan of that. I think we have sort of added a lot of complexity over the years. Can you expound a little bit on that about how an effective approach reduces complexity?
Yeah. Well, for one, salespeople are not administrators in the traditional sense. Like, so the admin work, you'll find, it's like talking to an artist. They're kind of messy.
Yeah,
They make beautiful things, and sometimes in a very strange way to get there. Um, so we're all a bit of an alien in that regard in the sales world. But what we're really not is administrators. And so the problem with planning is that typically it's happening at the end of the fiscal year, which is the busiest time for the sales team and marketing team. And now you're saying we want to pull you into meetings to talk about quotas and plans. And he's like, I'm happy to think about that, but right now I'm just trying to hit the one I have, right? So a lot of the complexity for sales, especially in sales leadership, is the administrative work of working back and forth with your sales ops, your rev ops, your marketing teams. Depending on what company and what your culture is, sometimes those people are all at odds with each other. Sometimes they're in complete harmony with each other. But there's always a bit of a political snafu there, just in terms of how to communicate, how to be clear, and then how to make sure that you're not appearing to listen and then just doing what you want anyway, which tends to happen a lot. And a lot of it's just because we're all in siloed communication skills. Like, we have Slack and we have email and we have Google Docs, and we're making comments in spreadsheets, and the communication's all over the place. And trying to keep up with all that communication while at the same time running a team of people, that's the biggest like headache for a lot of folks. If you could say there's one spot we're doing planning, and there's one place where we're commenting, and there's reports and dashboards that tell us and teach us we're all working from the same sheet of music. Like, I don't have some magical sales planning spreadsheet that I've been using for 15 years that I'm trying to get everyone else to buy into my thinking and my approach. Like, hey, trust my plan. Look at my success. It works. And then sales ops saying, cool, that works for you. But there's all these other people it doesn't work for. So by putting everyone kind of on an equal playing field with the same data, then you have to confront what the data is actually telling you. Now, if the data is wrong, then you have a different problem. Then you got to talk with your IS team and figure out how to get the right data in there, because the system's only good as the data you put in it. But if you can minimize the amount of distraction, the amount of locations where you're looking at information and trying to cull together, all the while in between the regular job you're doing, that would go 90% of the way to solving some of the biggest problems that people have from just an overly complex time of year, where stress and lack of sleep and worry gets in the way of sound thinking, sound decision making, and proper investment.
Yeah, it's I think about this issue of kind of non-rationalized technology. You sort of started with that, and I just saw a stat the other day that the average rep has 10 sales tools, right? And it just it
Oh, yeah.
that's not. I saw another stat that 70% of reps said, "I do not want to fill out another form," and it's not. I don't think that's just like a prima donna pushback. That's not value added time, whether it's a CRM or whatever it is they're filling out. And there's so much data now where we can be giving insight to reps versus asking them for insight that then rolls up to us. And I feel like that's such a massive shift that's about to take place.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, a lot of the salespeople I know that are great in my career, one of the first things they ask themselves when they're presented with a task is, "Will this make me money?" If the answer is no, they don't prioritize it. And the people that are great employees but don't make money are the ones that prioritize the task
Right.
over the
Yeah.
acquisition of revenue.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting dichotomy. To your point, is like I said, I want to go back to being administrators. Like, you don't want your salespeople calling, writing up the playbook. You want them running the plays.
Yes.
And so the more you can keep your athletes on the field, the better chance you have of winning. And the more you have them sitting on the bench looking at playbooks and analyzing film and not doing the thing that's actually going to help them execute, it's going to cost you. That's not to say that you shouldn't invest in training and all that kind of stuff, right? We all know the value of that. But if you're spending a lot of your time, if it takes you, I'll give you an example. Prospecting is a great example of this, right? You've got 9 tools connected to each other, and you've got a pull list, and you've got to filter the list, and you've got to run it through some sort of HubSpot / Salesforce marketing engine, and then you're into that contact is now going to get pushed into a CRM, and now that CRM needs to be updated and managed, and then you have tools that are connecting all your emails and phone dialers so that you can keep track of the activity in all those systems. And that, I mean, just from an onboarding standpoint, if you're setting up 10 tools, which, I just did this as I came on board with Fullcast, it literally takes you weeks to get all that stuff dialed in
Yeah.
before you're even on the, getting in your hands and getting into the loam of the sales soil. Right. So that's, that's a challenge that we see in sales. But, if you understand how long that process takes, because you can measure it and you can see it and you can say, okay, what was our average time to deal one closure? And then what does that tell us about how we should be thinking about our ramp? Is the ramp acceptable as it stands? Right. As a business, you can say, well, if 90 days is not acceptable, what can we do as a company to identify that we see that there's a problem here, to peel that back to 60 days? And again, that's where your planning tool becomes really important, because it's going to keep track of those kinds of metrics for you. You're going to
It's
be able to
yeah.
understand and understand it by region or geography or industry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something you said reminded me. One of my partners the other day was telling me about a book about a boat racing team, and the leader of this team, anything that came up, he would say, "Will it make the boat go faster?" And it's funny because that has taken a hold in our organization when we talk about, hey, can we do this? Should we do this? Should we add this feature? And always go back to, our version of boat going faster is winning more deals, winning more optimized deals. And it's such a cool filter to have that in there. That thing kind of changed my mind. So this is
The other question I would ask is, even though it's going faster, how long are people going to want to stay on that boat?
right. Well, and unfortunately, in our organization, accidentally, someone once called the boat a goat. So now the saying in our organization is, "Will it make the goat go faster?" And so we've just adopted that, but we know what it means. So
That's pretty good.
yeah, I'd mentioned one of the reasons I really wanted to do this is you care about this, you're good at it, and the third piece was, personally, like, I'm learning a lot about territory management, so I appreciate it. It seems to me that, as I go through everything we talked about, there's kind of massive shifts in the macro market. There's massive shifts now in technology and the availability of data. And that is, like, what I just heard in talking to you, is that's impacting the way we think about this, like in a good way. That we can kind of harness all that and think about territory management differently. So you've been really generous with your time and your insight, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the territory management is kind of an anchor point, but the inherent value, and you look at some of the tools that have been widely successful, like a Salesforce, for example, they're constantly innovating and growing and building into the platform. And that's what we do at Fullcast as well. We do 4 releases a year. So when you're thinking about the fact that we're at the forefront of solving a problem that no one's really ever solved before, there's been attempts at it. You're really thinking about a partnership with a long-term vendor. Is There's where they are, and then there's where we expect that they're going to be. Right. So there's a lot of people in this space right now doing some things better than others, and we're in that space. I think the fundamental difference in why, I have 7 kids, the reason why I took my savings and invested into this company is because I can see where they are and I can see where they're going, and I can see that nobody else has that same trajectory or plan. And so, it's like people that bought into Salesforce early, it was just for managing sales contracts and deals, right? And just a sales, they called the Sales Cloud. Now what it is huge. It's everything, right? It's everything on the front office. And so that's the picture we're painting for all things RevOps, is that finally there's a purpose-built platform specifically for this process that allows you to maintain and manage throughout the year, that connects with all of your other tools that you have to live with and need. So I think if you're interested in trying to find a new way to do business better, if you're interested in protecting your investment in sales and marketing, if you're interested in getting out of spreadsheets and doing more driving of the car and running the business than actually just fixing what leak has sprung,
Yeah.
check out Fullcast. I think there's a lot there for them.
Cool. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Completely insightful.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, appreciate you having me, and you guys have a great afternoon.
Thanks.